You're listening to Let's Talk Sustainable Business.
Hi, my name is Barbara Mendes-Jorge, and I'm a sustainability communications expert based in Brussels, Belgium. It's a pleasure to welcome you to this edition of Let's Talk Sustainable Business, a series brought to you by the Conference Board. This is the second instalment of our two-part conversation with Cara Fulcher, Director of Sustainability North America at Michelin. If you haven't listened to part one yet, please do go back into our catalogue to listen to it first. Welcome back to the podcast, Cara.
Thanks, Barbara. Great to be back.
So in part one, we talked about how Michelin's approach to sustainability has evolved over the years, how the company's internal carbon pricing system changed the way Michelin does business, and the role collaboration plays in accelerating climate action, particularly within the tyre industry. In this second part, I'd love to talk to you more about the social side of sustainability, a bit more about biodiversity and your views on climate policy. So in the previous episode, you briefly outlined Michelin's targets relating to environment, people, and profit. But as we're talking more about the social side, could you tell me a bit more what you're doing in the people pillar of your sustainability strategy?
Sure. So, as you say, we focus on all three areas and make sure of people, profit, and planet, and make sure that we're moving in all of them. And as we peel back the layers, there's a lot of activity under each of these, sometimes quite diverse, as you heard with our planet pillar last time, similar with our people pillar. So, as an industrial company, of course, we have to start with the safety of our team members. At the same time, we recognize that safety is not the only thing that comprises a good life for our employees, and so we have to also focus on their well-being. And as a worldwide employer, we recognize the variability of the places where we operate in terms of what the norms are, what's standardly available, and so to support a uniform level of benefit for all of our employees, regardless of where they happen to be working for us. We are in the process right now of rolling out what we call the Michelin One Care program. So this is a program that offers all of our employees worldwide a package of social benefits reflecting three core priorities: making sure that employees have time off work for a new arrival of a family member, that there are death benefits for families of employees so that they can face these changes in their circumstances with a degree of security and confidence, and finally, healthcare coverage for all of our employees and their families. We've also been recently recognized by the Fair Wage Network for providing a living wage across our operations. And sitting in the global north, all of this may feel fairly obvious, but as a worldwide employer, one recognizes pretty quickly that it's not necessarily a given everywhere that one might be operating. So if those are within our operations, we're also concerned about the safety and well-being along our value chain. And here specifically, we're concerned with human rights in the supply chain. So we've been awarded from the supply chain platform evaluator EcoVadis their platinum status, reflecting our efforts and our successes in this space. And as I've mentioned before, we have a very close connection to the production of natural rubber worldwide, which we estimate is a value chain involving 6 million people, many of them smallholder farmers, so think fewer than 8 acres or 2 or 3 hectares. This in tropical forests from Brazil across Western Africa to Indonesia and Thailand. And so we estimate that of those 6 million, about a third of them, so about 2 million of these contributors, are part of our own supply chain. And so we've been working for nearly a decade to establish transparency in this critical space, notably with an app called Rubberway that's accessible on smartphones around the world. It was launched in 2017 to map practices and encourage socially and environmentally sustainable supply chain. And by the end of last year, we're quite pleased that over 80% of our supply volumes were mapped through this app.
6 million people. That's very interesting that you managed to estimate this number. What are the most difficult challenges and, I mean, to balance it, the biggest opportunities for being a worldwide employer operating in so many different areas with so much differing and I guess sometimes conflicting legislation?
Well, I think it's important to have a strong vision of what it is that you as a company stand for, what you are after. I mentioned previously that it was really just at the beginning of this decade that we were formalizing and articulating our all sustainable people, profit, planet approach to how we operate as a business, not just for today, but for the decades to come. But this is rooted in a set of values that are far older and date to the time when our company was still run by people bearing the Michelin family name. And so we certainly, when I hired in a decade ago, we spoke regularly about our values, the values of the company. That, of course, meant we had respect for customers, but also and of course shareholders. We are in a capitalist society after all, but also focused on respect for people, for the environment, for facts. And so all of this helps us, I would say, consistently navigate our way through these spaces and solving for these different situations that we find ourselves in worldwide.
It's interesting you say that it's the traditional values that help guide you when sustainability might seem like a very modern thing for especially for big companies. But in fact, yeah, there are companies as old and older than Michelin where that is really a part of their DNA.
Absolutely.
So moving from the social side to biodiversity. So you did touch upon this in part one briefly. In 2018, Michelin committed to Act4Nature. So that's a French initiative led by business networks with scientific partners, environmental NGOs, and public bodies. And the goal of Act4Nature is to, quote, mobilize more companies in favor of nature, in part by helping them better integrate biodiversity into their strategies. So I wanted to ask you to expand a bit more on why you chose to commit to Act4Nature specifically, and what biodiversity projects and targets have you chosen to prioritize?
So, as I think we discussed before, there are a lot of details as we move into our environmental commitments, from decarbonization to material stewardship, and then working to protect plants and animals and their habitat. And Act4Nature has helped put some structure around that. Interesting, because while many of our commitments really look out to 2050 for their accomplishment, Act4Nature has us reaching our goal by 2030. And so, specifically in that space, we have committed to develop biodiversity management plans for all of our industrial sites and to begin to work on that. So, we are actively in the process of developing even templates and knowledge of what does a plan look like for an industrial site, and how do we get the knowledge necessary into a format that we can have a standard process around the world. So we've been working our way through that in the last 2 years and expect to have all of those sites mapped out, certainly by the end of this decade. It's also in the context of the Act4Nature commitments that we have been working on executing life cycle assessments for all of the changes that go into our products. I mentioned before, we're in the process by 2050 of transitioning 100% of the 200 materials that go into our tires from traditional feedstocks to renewable or recycled feedstocks. And that sounds noble, but a lot of times changes can happen that are not necessarily beneficial when they net out against human, environmental, and biodiversity concerns. So, as part of that Act4Nature structure, we're doing the hard work of checking that every material change, every product redesign, everything new that comes to the marketplace is really improving the biodiversity and the environmental impact of what it's replacing. So, keeping a lot of people very busy in that space.
Yeah, I'm interested. I think you mentioned that that's something you've been focusing on, particularly in the last 2 years. But how long have you been looking at Michelin's projects through that biodiversity lens? Do you feel that it's something actually that goes back a long way, or is it a more recent way of analyzing your impact?
So I think our concern for biodiversity is fairly well established, frankly, at this point. We have we have in fact just celebrated this year 20 years of a project in Brazil. So to give some context, that is focused really on restoring biodiversity alongside natural rubber production. So back in the 1980s, in fact, Michelin bought a rubber plantation in the Atlantic forest of Brazil. So that's farther east than the Amazon. in 2004, so 20 years ago, we were recognizing in that forest the impact of a wave of disease that was really threatening the ability of those the plantation as well as other production in that area to continue to be fruitful. And that had the knock-on effect of threatening the livelihoods of the people that were living in those communities. And so it was in 2004 that we created something that we call the Green Gold Bahia program and the ecological reserve at this plantation that we had already owned for a number of years. And this program focuses on protection, research, ecotourism, environmental education, and women's leadership. As part of the reforestation program, for example, over 100,000 trees of nearly 350 different species have been replanted in the forest, creating corridors for wildlife to access the areas, right? That's increasingly part of what scientists recognize as being so critical, is having corridors for wildlife to migrate. So this has been helpful in that respect. In fact, we've seen over 100% increase in the mammal and wild bird population in these areas where we've been engaged in reforestation. And this has been especially heartening with those species that are otherwise threatened by extinction. So we've been doing that for 20 years at this point.
I was going to ask, have you visited the area, or is there plans to in future? Because that sounds very interesting to go and see that progress in action.
Yeah, I actually had the privilege of being down there earlier this year at the facility in Brazil, and was able to meet the ecologist who has put this work in place. And so really fascinating, and just the grit and the determination to carry out that work over the course of 20 years, and developing novel techniques of how do you even recreate some of the services that nature provided in order to restore the biodiversity, right? If you've got plant seeds that in a natural cycle would first be ingested by a species, processed through their digestive system as a precursor, a necessary precursor for them even to germinate. Well, if those species are absent or not in sufficient population, how do you restore that cycle? That's a fascinating scientific question, but also one that takes patience and determination. And so really impressive to see that work.
Sounds super interesting. Thank you. So in the past, Michelin has been questioned for its links to deforestation. In 2014, Michelin joined a rubber plantation project after buying a stake in the Indonesian rubber company RLU. Then Michelin became RLU's sole shareholder in 2022, repaying the green bonds that were raised by the project. However, Michelin was accused of knowing that RLU had cleared thousands of hectares of forest in the run-up to the joint venture. And when questioned about it, Michelin said, "We are doing everything we can to achieve and exceed our reforestation goals. The implementation of this policy may encounter many difficulties, but this does not change our medium and long-term objectives." And a UNEP advisor also said of the project, "Based on our assessment, RLU will save more forests than those cleared by the company itself in the past." So could you share a little bit more information about this project and whether it's changed your approach to biodiversity projects similar to this one?
Well, so Barbara, that is such an interesting story, and such interesting. I find the tropical forests and the natural rubber production just a fascinating space globally, whether it's in Brazil or in Indonesia. You know, as you mentioned in my biography, I was originally trained as a historian, and not just a historian, but a historian of the modern era. And so I recognize how hard it can be to capture accurately complex stories in real time, even for actors with good intentions. And so the claims that you mentioned, I would say, fall victim to these challenges. My colleagues who were on the ground at the beginning of our engagement in Indonesia speak of really heartbreaking conditions when they first arrived there in the regions of Sumatra and Borneo a decade ago. And so we launched the project in 2015, as you mentioned, seeing real opportunity to make a significant contribution to the social, environmental, agricultural, and economic progress of the natural rubber sector in Indonesia. And so this project was really there to remedy such a catastrophic environmental and social situation on the ground there. And so RLU is engaging with stakeholders to ensure the success of this really very ambitious project, like I said, across these multiple facets, and take constructive feedback to help deliver a sustainable natural rubber supply while protecting and strengthening the environment and the local communities. You asked about how this changes or what this means, and I would just like to highlight a couple of key elements when we talk about understanding natural rubber production, not only in Indonesia, but across the regions, as I mentioned. So first, there's the topic of deforestation with a host of tropical and forest-based commodities, not just ours, and which is why Michelin was the first tire manufacturer to support having natural rubber included in the European regulation on deforestation-free products. Beyond deforestation, as we've been talking about, there are biodiversity concerns. And so I mentioned what we've been doing in Brazil, but it also has an impact. These concerns also have an impact in Indonesia. So at RLU, there are two natural parks that border our concessions there. And these forests are home to a variety of protected and endangered animals, including, the charismatic ones like elephants and tigers, orangutans, gibbon monkeys, eagles, hornbills. And with the RLU concession, in light of the presence of these important species, we've already set aside, or we've already marked for conservation more than 15,000 hectares or 37,000 acres, which is about 20% of the surface area. And that's to conserve the land, but also to give these species and others a safe haven as they move about. Obviously, they're not paying much attention to lines on the map that show whether they're in the park or in the concession. And then I would just, since we started this section talking about people, I'd like to return to that topic of people, because as we look at these forests worldwide and the production of natural rubber, there are also workforce considerations. So at RLU, we have, by the end of 2023, calculated that we've created over 4,000 direct jobs, which is about half of what we expect at the maturity of the project. And we have already invested 12.5 million euros in housing and other infrastructure for the communities that live and work in these regions of Borneo and Sumatra. So think of clinics and schools providing access to water and electricity. So these are all important developments for the communities living there. And if we spin the globe back to Brazil, as I mentioned before, in Bahia, we work with locals there to empower them through environmental education and entrepreneurship with the regional youth, so that they have better farming practices, so that they have opportunities to engage in a better quality of life there on the land without having to migrate to the cities to keep them in their home communities. And we also work with women through leadership programs to unlock their opportunity to serve as leaders in their communities.
Thank you. So we've talked about the social side of sustainability, about biodiversity. But to finish this part, as a Brussels-based podcast, I love to ask my guests their views on climate-related policy, which you've already touched upon. But I wanted to ask for a bit more information on how closely you're following the ever-changing ESG regulatory landscape in North America, where you're based, and in Europe, as Michelin is also headquartered in France.
So as a French company, we are in the first wave of reporters complying with CSRD, and that builds on the requirements of the French Universal Registration Document, which, if you've had the pleasure of handling one of those, ours certainly was over a 500-page annual financial and extra financial disclosure, so already quite robust. Nevertheless, CSRD is a beast of a different color, if you will, and we're spooled up and working our way through that actively right now. In North America, across the United States and Canada, it's a much more fragmented landscape. US and Canada moving at different speeds, states within the United States moving at different speeds and independently of the federal government. So we're keenly watching all of this to make sure that we'll be well positioned to comply when the dust finally settles out on all of those. We're also keenly watching evolving guidelines with respect to commercial claims. The Green Guides, the Competitive Bureau in Canada, obviously work going on in Europe as well. So that's also a very interesting space for us right now.
And so, what do you see as the biggest challenges and opportunities in this new reporting landscape?
So we face a moment wherein we must meet these very complex reporting requirements. Right? We already had a 500-page report. Now we have a different set of numbers and metrics that we need to identify and work through. And so we do all of this even as we're trying to act. And having been to Climate Week in September, we realized that the urgency of positive impact is growing day by day, month by month. And as a universal truth, nobody that I talk to across industries has the resources that they need to do either of these things well, whether it's the reporting or the acting. And so then we layer on top of that the controversy and the division between the largest global markets on these topics. And so teams internally, whether in various companies, are operating in the face of mixed signals, which can only present additional pushes and pulls internally as we try to get alignment and prioritization of these things. So it's a challenging moment in many respects. I am heartened that if California holds its ground and rolls out the requirements that have been approved by its legislative bodies, then we should get more clarity on what this landscape is, because the majority of the global market will be covered by the reporting requirements of when you add California together with the European regulation. So at least that will remove some of the uncertainty, I think. I think the real opportunity, which is not necessarily well captured in everything right now, but if we can get it right, is the importance of understanding what's happening along our value chains, not just for ourselves, but really broadly across corporations, because it really feels like there's so much happening there that implicates everybody along the value chain and will require coherent conversations in order to underpin the necessary collaboration. We really need to start with understanding what that is so that we can have those conversations and collaborate in those important ways.
I would be remiss if I didn't mention that the Conference Board has released a report called Managing International ESG Disclosure. So if you're one of the companies struggling, which I think is everyone, as you say, at least there's solidarity there between industry on how difficult it's going to be. I would highly recommend looking at that report, especially because I think the main thing is that no company is going to get it right first time. It's about reporting what you can and not focusing too much on it being perfect, just getting something on the page. So it's interesting that everyone is feeling the same. No one is showing bravado that they've got the perfect sustainability report ready. So to my final question, I've done a two-part question. What's the most important lesson you've learned while working in sustainability for Michelin? And what advice would you give someone who is starting out in their sustainability career or is starting out in their sustainability reporting journey?
So I think that there are two critical phenomena in this space, and that is there are problems or challenges that are solved, and it's really a question of resources to execute them. Solved doesn't mean resolved, but we know what needs to be done. We know how to get there. We just have to mobilize to get it done. So there's that piece. Then there are questions that remain unsolved, that we haven't found the answer at all, much less the resources to get to a new place. And so these are two very different activities within the sustainability space. Some of it is just a question of grit and getting it done. Some of it is far more innovative. And for me personally, it's really that former bucket of challenges that interests me. And so for others with a similar mindset that are inspired by the problems that are not yet solved, I would say don't forget the soft skills, right? Especially in this transverse and complex space, being able to listen, to communicate, to collaborate, to influence, to engage in critical thinking. All of these are things that I think serve well and sometimes get underplayed and overlooked, but I think that's our path forward.
Don't forget the soft skills, a lovely message to finish on. Thank you very much, Cara, for joining us today for part 2. And thanks to our listeners. If you enjoyed this episode, please remember to subscribe to this podcast series and explore the entire catalogue of podcast programming from the Conference Board by visiting our website at tcb.org/podcasts. See you next time.
That was Let's Talk Sustainable Business.